Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Stories like this are not easy to tell, and they are even harder to hear. If you feel the weight of these forgotten voices, if you believe these hidden histories deserve to be uncovered, then subscribe to this channel. It costs nothing, but it keeps these buried truths from fading back into silence. Imagine being born into a nightmare so twisted that even the family tree collapses under its own weight. Imagine a child, still a child herself, carrying life inside her belly. A life not created by innocence or love, but by a cycle of blood so entangled that it became both womb and grave. This is not folklore. This is not legend. It is history, buried deep beneath layers of shame and silence. A baby born of a pregnant child, the most inbred infant ever recorded, and the story that led to its existence is one you were never meant to hear. The truth begins not in the moment of birth, but in the soil of generations before. A family locked away from the world, swallowed whole by isolation, where tradition was not celebration but survival, and where survival twisted into something darker. A place where fathers became uncles, where brothers became husbands, and where the very definition of family eroded into dust. In such a world, children were not raised, they were consumed by it. And one child, no older than 12, was chosen not by fate, but by the will of blood, to carry within her a child that was never meant to exist. The horror of this story is not in the grotesque details of deformity or disease, but in the quiet acceptance that surrounded it. No one came to stop it. No one looked in and said, "Enough." They lived hidden, away from the judgment of neighbors, in places where roads turned to dirt and names were whispered but never written down. Their children were born, their children were buried, and the cycle continued, unbroken, like a curse etched into their very bones. But among all those cursed births, one stood apart, a child born from a pregnant child, a baby whose very first breath carried with it centuries of broken lineage. As you hear this, your mind may already recoil. You may wish to turn away, to imagine this story belongs to another country, another people, another time. But it doesn't. It happened here, in America's own shadowlands, hidden just far enough that the rest of the nation could pretend it didn't exist. And that denial, that willful blindness, was the soil in which this horror grew. This is not just the story of one baby. It is the story of how human lives can be twisted by silence, by isolation, and by the terrible weight of bloodlines turned inward. And if you choose to keep listening, you will descend deeper into this forgotten history step by step, until you too feel the suffocating grip of a family that consumed itself from within. The girl was small, barely into her second decade of life, but already her body bore the burden of a lineage collapsing in on itself. She had never known freedom, never known choice, never known the world outside the shack she was born in. For her, family was not a web of love, but a cage of expectation, where the roles of parent and sibling, of elder and child, blurred until there was nothing left but confusion. She did not see what was wrong, because she had never seen what was right. And by the time her stomach began to swell, the whispers in the house were not of shock, but of inevitability. Her pregnancy was not celebrated, it was not condemned, it was simply absorbed into the grim rhythm of life behind those walls. The older women, themselves once pregnant as children, moved with a tired efficiency, guiding her body through the steps they had once endured. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no official records, just silence, and the unspoken knowledge that this was not the first time, and it would not be the last. The child inside her was something different, though. Every generation of inbreeding brings with it new weight, a heavier toll taken on the fragile human body. What began as crossed eyes and slurred speech in grandparents evolved into twisted limbs and malformed jaws in their descendants. And for this baby, born of a womb too young and too broken, the consequences were catastrophic. The bloodline was folding over itself, generation after generation, until the very idea of new life was barely sustainable. When the day came, there were no cries of joy. The birth was not an event but a sentence carried out. The baby emerged frail, its skin thin as paper, its skull oddly shaped, its tiny mouth struggling to draw in air. In those first hours, the weight of centuries pressed down on the child's chest, and with every weak gasp, it was as though history at sea. Elf was punishing the bloodline that had refused to let go. Some say the baby's eyes never opened. Others claim they did, wide, unblinking, with a gaze that seemed more curse than blessing. But the true horror lies not in the baby's frailty, nor even in its deformities, but in the acceptance that surrounded it. In that shack, this was normal, this was life. No one screamed, no one called for help. The silence of generations carried on, as if this baby was not a tragedy, but simply the next link in a chain no one dared to break. The shack itself stood like a monument to decay, hidden deep in the woods, where roads thinned and maps ceased to matter. Its walls leaned inward as if the house itself were collapsing under the weight of what it had witnessed. The roof sagged, patched with scraps of tin and tar paper. Inside, the air was heavy, a mix of mildew, smoke, and the faint metallic scent of blood that seemed to cling to the wooden planks. It was not a home, it was a tomb that kept breathing, trapping generation after generation in its rotting ribs. Children grew up in those rooms with no books, no toys, no escape. They learned from whispers and from shadows, their world measured in footsteps between the stove and the bed, the door and the dirt outside. And when night fell, the silence pressed in so thick that even the insects seemed to retreat. Within those walls, morality dissolved. What was unthinkable in the outside world became routine here. The line between father and brother, mother and sister, blurred until the words themselves lost meaning. The young girl who carried the baby had never seen a schoolroom, never heard the sound of laughter in a playground. Her innocence had been stolen not in a single moment of violence, but in a lifetime of grooming, of being told that this was what families did, that her body was not hers, but the continuation of blood. By the time she understood what was happening to her, it was too late. Her womb had already been claimed, her childhood already erased. The baby's birth was not an interruption of this cycle, but its cruel continuation. The others barely looked at it, their eyes dulled by years of repetition. Some muttered that it wouldn't survive the winter, as though the child's death would be just another passing in a long line of forgotten graves. And maybe that was the most chilling part of all, the utter absence of shock, the absence of outrage. For them, the unimaginable was no longer monstrous, it was routine. Outside, the world carried on. Neighbors miles away lived ordinary lives, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that within walking distance a nightmare was unfolding. This was how it endured, not because no one knew, but because no one wanted to know. The land itself seemed to conspire with the family, hiding their sins beneath the canopy of trees, burying their cries in the earth. And in that silence, a baby born of a child struggled for air, carrying within its tiny body the story of a bloodline devouring itself. The story of this baby cannot be told without tracing the roots that fed it, roots tangled so tightly in themselves that they strangled everything they touched. In the beginning, it may have been survival, families cut off from towns, living in poverty so deep that outsiders never came near. Marriage was rare, strangers rarer still. Brothers married sisters, fathers laid claim to daughters, and each new generation folded back into the last. What started as isolation hardened into ritual, and ritual became law. By the time the pregnant child was born, this law was absolute. Her parents had been raised in the same cycle, their parents before them, each generation knowing nothing else. In such families, the body becomes both shrine and prison. The girl's womb was never hers. It belonged to the family, to the bloodline, to the unspoken duty of carrying forward what should have been allowed to die. This was not about choice, it was about inevitability. And the cost was everywhere. Bodies weakened, minds fractured. Some children never learned to speak, their tongues heavy, their thoughts tangled. Others walked with twisted limbs, their spines curved like bent branches. But worse than the deformities was the numbness. A child born into such a family did not scream against its chains because it had never known freedom. Pain was not recognized as pain. Abuse was not recognized as abuse. It was simply life. The baby born of the pregnant child represented the culmination of that decay. Its blood carried not just the genes of its parents, but the stacked mutations of countless unions before them. Scientists who have studied extreme inbreeding describe it as a mirror closing in on itself, reflections multiplying until the image shatters into distortion. That baby was the breaking point, the moment where life itself seemed to protest, where the body came into the world already exhausted by history. But the true tragedy was not written in science or medicine. It was written in silence. The silence of a child forced into motherhood. The silence of a family that treated the grotesque as ordinary. The silence of neighbors who looked the other way. And the silence of a society that prefers its monsters to exist in fiction, not in the backwoods of its own country. The baby lived for a time, days, maybe weeks, some say longer, but every breath it took was a reminder of what had been done, a reminder of a cycle that devoured innocence and spat out ghosts. It was not just a baby, it was a warning. There are stories that linger in whispers, passed down through frightened tongues, and this is one of them. Some say the baby did not survive its first winter, its frail body surrendering to the cold before its first birthday. Others claim it lived longer, hidden in the shadows of the shack, a silent reminder of what happens when bloodlines fold too tightly upon themselves. No record was kept, no grave was marked. The truth lies buried not in soil, but in memory. And memory is a fragile thing, easily twisted, easily erased. What cannot be erased, however, is the legacy. Families like these do not exist in isolation by accident. They are tolerated, sometimes even protected, by a society that prefers silence over confrontation. The authorities rarely came knocking. When they did, they turned back quickly, unwilling to wade too deep into the rot. And neighbors, if they suspected, said nothing. To acknowledge what was happening meant taking responsibility, and responsibility meant shattering the illusion that such horrors belonged to another time or another land. The pregnant child's baby became more than just a single life. It became a symbol, though no one dared to name it. A symbol of what happens when shame festers, when abuse becomes generational, when cycles of trauma are left unbroken. Each cry that echoed in that shack was not just the sound of a child, it was the sound of history refusing to die quietly. And those who heard it, whether family or stranger, carried the weight of knowing, even if they pretended not to. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Most people would have clicked away by now, unwilling to stare this kind of truth in the face. But the fact that you're here means something. It means you've stepped into the silence and chosen not to look away. So let me ask you, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have had the strength to break the chain, or would you have become another link in it? Tell me in the comments, because history is not just something we inherit, it's something we choose to either carry forward or cut free. The baby born of a pregnant child may not have lived long, but its existence alone carved a scar into history, a scar that demands we remember, even when every instinct tells us to forget. The deeper you look, the more you realize this story was never about one child or one baby or even one family. It was about the way silence allows horror to thrive. For every shack hidden in the woods, there were others like it, tucked into valleys, forgotten hills, remote corners where the outside world rarely stepped. These families did not appear overnight. They were the result of generations of neglect. Poverty left them stranded, isolation left them unseen, and shame made them untouchable. What happened inside those walls was not just biology, but psychology. When a family teaches its children that love and violation are the same, that family becomes a closed system of lies. Each generation grows up believing that what is happening to them is normal, even necessary. A girl becomes a mother before she becomes a woman. A boy becomes both father and brother before he becomes a man, and no one questions it, because questioning means tearing apart the only world they know. The child mother in this story never had that choice. Her body was used before she could even understand what it meant to own it. And when her baby was placed in her arms, she did not see it as monstrous. She saw it as hers, because that was all she had ever been told to expect. That is the cruelest part. The victims of this cycle rarely saw themselves as victims at all. To them, life was a burden to endure, not a gift to be cherished. And so the baby lived, however briefly, in a world where its very existence was both inevitable and unbearable. Each breath was heavy with the weight of centuries. Each beat of its tiny heart was a reminder of choices never made, chances never taken, freedoms never known. The baby's deformities were not the mark of evil, but of neglect. Neglect from a family, from neighbors, from a society that allowed isolation to fester until innocence itself became the sacrifice. When you strip away the layers, you are left with a simple truth. This baby was born not just from flesh, but from silence. And silence is the most dangerous inheritance of all. It keeps the cycle alive. It ensures that history repeats. It buries the dead without ever naming them, and it asks you, the listener, to carry that silence forward unless you choose to break it. And so we arrive at the question that hangs heavier than all the rest. What became of the baby born of a pregnant child? Some say its life ended quickly, that it slipped away quietly in the dark of night, buried in shallow earth with no marker to tell the world it ever existed. Others insist it lingered longer, a fragile presence in the shack, fed and clothed in scraps, surviving not out of love, but out of habit. The truth is lost, scattered in whispers, because no one cared enough to keep it safe. And that is perhaps the most haunting fate of all, to be born into a world where your life is so unbearable to remember that forgetting becomes easier than knowing. But whether the baby lived weeks or years, its presence left a scar deeper than flesh. It stood as the living proof of a cycle that should never have continued, a cycle that fed on innocence until innocence itself was devoured. The pregnant child who bore it was both victim and vessel, forced into motherhood before she had even left childhood behind. And her silence became the silence of history, a silence we are breaking now by speaking of her. This story is not just about inbreeding, not just about deformity, not even just about poverty. It is about the way human beings can turn away when faced with what is uncomfortable. It is about the way entire communities can build fences not from wood, but from indifference. And it is about the way cycles of violence endure, not because they are strong, but because no one is brave enough to stop them. The baby may have been the most inbred child ever born, but it was also something more. It was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when humanity allows itself to collapse inward, when bloodlines replace compassion, when silence replaces action. Look long enough into that mirror, and you begin to wonder, if this happened there, in that shack, in that family, how many are they? Our stories lie buried, hidden in plain sight across the forgotten corners of this country. The baby's cry may have faded, but its echo remains. An echo that forces us to confront not just the horror of one family, but the danger of every silence we allow. And if that echo unsettles you, it should, because that means you are listening,